Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Personality Yoda. My name is Becky, otherwise known as Ray, and I am here with the wonderful Jedi Master himself, Mr. Steve Cockram, currently taking a big sip of tea, I see.
It's actually hot right bean. I've got a sore throat, you see, so that's all it is. But I'm not looking for sympathy. Yoda doesn't get ill. I'm just 847 years old. That's all it is.
You're looking very well on it, may I say.
Oh.
We have good news for you. So today we are starting our new series on influence, all around how you build your own influence, how the different personality types undermine their influence. So stay tuned. So we have a whole series running just up to Christmas solely on this, which is really exciting. Before we get into that, the Cockram, tell me what's live, what's going on in the UK, what's the latest?
Well, the UK is officially in lockdown, although lockdown 2.0 is not as bad as lockdown 1.0. The reason being is Helen and I went for a walk into the village yesterday with Jemima, and Costa is open. So we managed to get a hot chocolate, a Terry's chocolate orange hot chocolate. You can't sit in, obviously, but if that's what lockdown is all about, then basically I can cope with that. Don't get me asking about they've banned golf playing, so I can go for a walk with somebody else outside, but I can't play golf with somebody. So there is the joy of the great rationality of the British government's use of statistics. But I guess, Ray, all that pales into insignificance compared to the dramas that are happening on the other side of the pond right now in the presidential election. I think my wife just shouted in that they're just calling Pennsylvania for Biden. And if any of you know your West Wing, which we're watching at the moment, you'll know Pennsylvania is always the one which makes the difference. So it will be interesting to see how the democratic process works out on the other side of the pond. I'm going to say nothing else because there's no way of saying anything which would be helpful to at least half of my friends in the US. So there we go.
I love it. Yes, you're right. The UK has gone into lockdown 2.0, so all the shops are closed. Good to know that Costa's open though. That's amazing. And we're allowed to leave our house for exercise and things like that. So everyone's praying that it's not going to be going on past Christmas, or at least lifting in December. So we shall see. I know, sad, hey? Steve, apart from getting withdrawal symptoms from golf,
I've got by the way, if those of you follow it in my back screen, you'll see a Mela Bowl. I actually won a competition last Friday. So if you can spot that at some point, that's awesome. But obviously, when you get to my age, anytime anyone gives you a silver bowl and a cut glass crystal, you obviously did something well. So yeah, there we go. That's another exciting thing. Anyway, back to the show, Bex. I know people are not interested in my
really important business. That's the really important business of influence. So, Steve, what I'd really love to know, kicking us off, this is we're using this session to do really an introductory to influence and why is it important. And then the later episodes are really going to dive deeper into the different personality types and how they really win influence or also undermine it. So, Steve, how does personality affect influence and why is it important? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen with you, Beck, so that at least you can see what I'm talking about here. So basically, when we deal with influence, what we're dealing with is something which is way more important than people realize, because people go, oh, they have influence, they don't. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to break down how do you... There we go. That's just to make sure I'm wide awake. So I'm glad that went off. What you do when you're building influence is recognize that there's a process happening. And that in the end, if you can understand how you win influence or how you lose influence, it'll help you. So this is the influence model, which basically Jeremy, my partner in crime, wrote a brilliant book called Leadership is Dead, I think it was. And we took the influence model and we kind of played around with it a bit, but and made it hopefully a little simpler to understand. But fundamentally, the first part of influence is always about establishing trust with an individual. If you try and go to relationship too quickly, it usually goes wrong. You have to start the process of influence by winning trust. And that often involves some kind of transaction. And what we'll do is I'll unpack for you the different stages that you have to unlock in order to win trust and just how quickly that happens. But the real goal, and this is something which we'll come back to again and again, that fundamentally the primary currency of wealth and influence in the new world exists between those two walls of self-preservation. So relationship where you establish long-term influence and impact in the life of another person is really where the world is at right now. You're never going to be able to compete purely on transaction, because there's always somebody who can usually do it cheaper than you can. But when you are able to establish long-term relationships, I'd say the winners of the new world will be those who can establish, maintain, and develop relationships that last. So there you go. Look, relationships are the primary currency of wealth and influence in the new world. And it is different in the digital world than it was from the industrial world, because the industrial world primarily valued what we call IQ, the classic intelligence, the manipulation of data, the ability basically to be very strategic in the way you did things. Well, the reality is just about every complex computation now is done by computer. And in the end, relationships are not established through IQ, although it's important, it's now assumed. Relationships are built really through EQ, emotional intelligence, and without PQ, self-awareness, personality intelligence, it's very, very difficult to build that emotional intelligence. So when I go back to here, the journey of building influence, of establishing relationships, long-term influence and impact, really requires you to be able to use self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and deploy your IQ in a way that basically leads to that core in the middle. So you don't get away with just being clever anymore in the new world. You actually have to have far greater, broader intelligence, and relationships and ultimately influence are the currency of wealth and influence in the new world. So I'm going to stop there just a second, Ray. Does that make sense? First of all, why I'm saying that influence is so important, because without influence, you will not win. But if you want to build influence, you have to learn how to build relationships, and you have to learn how to build trust as well.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So I'd love to dig a little bit deeper with this one. So in terms of talking around influence and how you build it, why is it so important and why people lose it?
Yep. Okay. So here's the way I look at it. To go, how do you build influence? Well, the first stage of building influence is what we call building trust. So when somebody meets you for the first time, 90% of first impressions are made in the first 90 seconds of meeting someone. So there we are. I call it the 90-90 principle. And the first impressions are more important than you realize. So therefore, the way you engage and the way you establish connection in those first 90 seconds goes an awful long way in that process. But this is a much deeper lens for looking at, right, how you build trust. Because in the end, there are 4 filters that at a subconscious level, everyone is asking before they decide whether they're going to trust you or ultimately whether they're going to buy something from you. And they are character, chemistry, competence, and credibility. All 4 of those are specific filters that actually people are asking, whether they realize it or not, by the way, about what you mean. So we've codified that a little bit and said, well, what do we mean by that? So these are the unspoken filters of trust. So the first one is what we call character. When somebody meets you or you're seeking to establish relationship with someone, they're going to ask this question at a subconscious level from your character. Do I trust you? Do I think you're a person of integrity? And ultimately, are you for me or are you for yourself? Now, they don't have a checklist, by the way. It's not what they're checking off, but that's what they're doing in their mind. That is an absolute foundational filter. Now, the second one is what we call chemistry. And chemistry says this: do I like you? Do I connect with you? Do I enjoy spending time with you? Because if I'm going to work with you, let alone have a relationship with you in the future, then we've actually got to enjoy being together and connecting with you. And I find it enjoyable to be around you. So, and then you have competency, where people will say things like, are you competent? Are you confident in your competence? And do you have a proven track record of success that backs up your belief that you are competent? So that's the third filter. And then lastly, the one which often requires a little more explanation, Becky, so you can ask on this one, is what we call credibility, which is to say, is your competence incredibly relevant to the challenges of the complexity of my reality? And are you able to access my world to design a solution with your competence that helps me achieve my goals? So if I go back to my drawing here again and say, okay, if the foundation of influence is trust, that's the first stage. All of those 4 filters, by the way, character, chemistry, competence, credibility, have to be unlocked in sequential filters. So really important you understand this, because when we go back to individual voices in the future and how they do this, you'll find that it's like a bit like a padlock that you might put on your bike or your locker at school. If you get 3 out of 4 right, you don't win a prize. 3 numbers out of 4 will not unlock the influence and the trust that you're looking for. You actually have to unlock all 4 of them in order to actually begin that foundational relational process of winning influence by establishing trust, and that usually means a transaction. So that's my little overview. Does that kind of make sense? I've got a couple more things, but I'm going to come back and ask Ray what you're thinking so far.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Back to the influence model.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain a bit about the 2 walls of self-preservation and how those 4 things are used to unlock those?
Well, it's not really. I think the thing is, if you think of a process, there are 3 stages to this. The first stage is you have to win trust with the individual you're seeking to have influence with. So if you don't get past step 1, there is no influence. So if you don't even manage to get to a transaction or a simple level of trust with an individual, there is no possibility of relationship. Stage 2 presupposes that you've already established influence through that trust. And then what happens is each person begins to have the opportunity to lower their wall of self-preservation. We all have one. And in the end, it's as both begin to trust one another and the relationship goes beyond transaction into something where we are now being more real and more open, it opens up the long-term opportunity for true influence and true impact. But what I really am saying to people today is, if you want to win influence, you have to start with trust, and you have to be agreed that actually, I'm never going to establish a long-term relationship with you if I haven't actually got to a place of trust where I've been through my 4 sequential filters with you and I've actually unlocked them all. And this is the big aha, Bex, is every foundational voice in the 5 voices ecosystem, every personality has a barrier to influence they have to overcome. And part of the fun of it is almost beginning to show people why certain foundational voices find it difficult. But with the exception of one, which I won't spoil just at the moment, every foundational voice has one of those areas which actually undermines them if they're not careful. So there we go. Keep coming back to me.
And I guess in the pre-lockdown era, it was much easier to build trust and relational capital with people when you're face to face. So people can naturally have more of a chemistry relationship with you. They can see your character a bit more. They can know whether they like you. Is it more difficult to navigate in the digital space? Any top tips for moving past that?
Yeah, it is. I used to have an axiom which said FaceTime without FaceTime doesn't work well, because in the end, there's things that we miss when we're not physically present. We pick up a lot of subconscious, unconscious clues about the people we're looking at. So if you imagine 90% of first impressions are made in the first 90 seconds of meeting someone. So the handshake, the way you dress, the way you smile, the way you engage eye-to-eye contact, the way you are interested before trying to be interesting, all of those things, Bex, are much, much, much easier face-to-face. Well, interestingly, what lockdowns proved is it's possible to do it, but fundamentally, people are having to work a lot harder to establish trust. Here's what I think is probably true. If you think of how online works, I think it is possible for me to establish trust online. I think I can just about get to a point where using video, it's very, very hard to do this one inside the walls of self-preservation. when actually you haven't had time together. So I'm thinking on my head here, as always, or thinking off the top of my head, I would say that basically it is possible to win trust in a digital world now because people have got more used to Zoom as a medium. I'm still really debating whether it's possible to achieve true influence and impact in a depth relationship without some form of actual physical interaction at the same time. So I think the new world basically will mean that the default will be digital, but actually we will use face-to-face for the most important relationships and probably the most significant moments in establishing that relational influence and impact.
That's awesome, particularly having those times of food. Any excuse to get together for food is definitely always a winner. Okay, fantastic. So I know we're going to go into the depth on each of the different 5 voices over the next series, over the next 5 weeks. You mentioned about the barriers. Do you want to go into any more detail on those now, or are you going to save those until the next episode?
I'll give you a teaser campaign, and what I'll do is I will test it with you, okay? So this is where you're going to get a chance to demonstrate your competence live, Bex, on air, as it were. So I hope you're feeling suitably empowered. So if you think for a moment, if the 4 filters are character, chemistry, competence, credibility, the first question I want to ask is for you to realize that each foundational voice has a start point. So some voices are more interested first in competence and credibility. Some foundational voices start first with character and chemistry. Interestingly, they, remember, have to unlock all 4. So it's not that you can just trade on 2 or 3, but it's really interesting in a relationship how you gauge whether somebody wants to establish competence, credibility first, or character and chemistry. So here's a question I'm going to ask you. You can see if you get this right. When you meet a nurturer, and you may not know, by the way, where do you think they're going to start in that question of trust? Is it character, chemistry, or competence, credibility, Ray? What are you going for?
Character and chemistry every time.
There you go. You feel less worried now that I've not asked you a difficult question. So nurturer, interestingly, when it comes to the influence model, will always start with character and chemistry. Why? Because they're relational first. So can you give me another foundational voice, Ray, that will start with character and chemistry?
Connectors and also creative feelers.
Oh, gold star. So you've indicated, and the key, where someone is a feeler in MBTI, or where someone is a nurturer, connector, or a creative connector as their foundational voice order, you will find that they are wired for relationship first before task. And so therefore, if you want to win influence with them, you actually usually have to start at the place where they feel most comfortable. So if you think about, back to my little analysis here, knowing that is so important. So if you're dealing with a nurturer or a connector, they're not interested in the first instance of how competent you are, how brilliant you are, or how incredibly relevant your consulting skills are to their world. They will only go to that side when they've actually established this element of character and chemistry. So 3rd gear conversations, the ability to be interested in them and to find out a bit about them and do a bit of small talk, is absolutely foundational for winning trust. Now, have a guess what happens if you start on the wrong side of the trust equation, Bex?
It breaks the trust relationship down.
Or it makes it very difficult. So if you think you've got 90 seconds to make 90% of your first impressions, now 90 seconds is actually longer than you think when you actually spend 90 seconds with somebody. But one of the first things you have to ask yourself, and this is why that self-awareness and that emotional intelligence is so important, is you have to decide, is the person I'm dealing with highly relational, or are they highly task focused? So if they're pioneers or guardians or creative pioneers, they will want you to start with competency and credibility first, because they're not really interested in getting to know you until they're certain that you are actually competent. So if you get that wrong, by the way, you burn a lot of your first 90 seconds of 90% of influence. So what I'm often doing is, if I'm going to meet somebody, I might do a little bit of research about them. I might look at what they've done in their background. I might look at their Facebook if I can get access to that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to judge often by the way they engage with me. What clues are they giving me about how they're wired? How relational are they? How charming are they? How warm are they in relation to me? And I almost always, if it's me, start with competency. Can you tell me, Bex, why, given a choice where I would start, is actually I almost always invariably start by assuming that somebody wants to know, am I competent? Come on, why would I do that?
Because the predators are so nice, they'll forgive you anyway, whereas the thing is so ruthless, they won't.
You've learned so well, young Padawan. I'm very proud of you. So that is absolutely true. So if you think about it, if you meet someone who's a pioneer, a guardian, or a creative pioneer, a thinker first, they are not looking for a new best friend. They're not really that interested in how nice you are, how kind you are, how compassionate you are, all the things about your family. They might learn how to ask those questions, but fundamentally they want to know, I've only got so much time. Are you competent, and is your competence credibly relevant to my world? Now, what will happen is this: if you relate to somebody first, as if that's the place to start, and it feels just a little bit awkward, or they're like, oh, then you can quickly change tack. And with a feeler, I always say, tell me a bit about you, tell me a bit about the family, what are you passionate about, what makes you tick. So if you think about it, it's really whether you do third gear first or whether you start in fourth gear. Are we at work? And once I've unlocked competency and credibility, then we go back to deciding whether we really enjoy being together. And your point was incredibly well made. The feeler will always forgive you. The kind of the person who's relationship first, you'll get clues almost immediately if you start in the wrong place with competence and credibility. Now, no one ever teaches you this stuff, by the way. So I look at the amount of times I'm a very, very rational, logical, analytical, competency, credibility is my filter. And Jeremy was the one who taught me how important it was through this model to really gauge, where does somebody want to start with me? How do you ask good questions in the beginning rather than front loading it with your competency? And the better you get at voices, by the way, the quicker you begin to spot some of the clues as to how somebody is wired. Your self-awareness, your learning of voices becomes something you can then deploy when it comes to the emotional intelligence before you bring your big IQ to bear. So Bex, talk to me. What else is useful? Are there questions that people have?
Yes. So I've got a question around, I'd love to kind of bring this back to some examples. So can you give me a situation where you personally undermined your influence? Why did it happen, and what did you do about it? I'm really making you think on the spot here, so apologies for that.
The reason I'm pausing is because I do it all the time. So I'm trying to think what the most, because I've been doing this Jedi mastering for a long time, I'm going back a long time because I watch what happens when you get it wrong. So I think the key thing for me is undermining my influence is where I try and almost, I try and sell myself to somebody because of the skill sets that I have. Because my default is, I know what your problem is. I think I can help you immediately. And when you do that so I have a particular set of skills in Liam Neeson's world. I mean, I can usually help people understand who they are. I'm keen to help solve them. And when people say, oh, I've got a real challenge, what I'm doing in my future, or I don't really know what to do in this situation, a relationship, or I'm really wondering particularly about whether I should start a new business, I leap immediately into my preferred mode of engagement, which is fourth gear, task, tell me about your situation, and then I'm into consulting and coaching. So where that goes wrong is when the person hasn't given you permission to have that level of influence or impact in their lives. So all of a sudden, I'm trying to assume a level of access and influence that I haven't actually earned, because what they really want to know with me is, Steve, you might be very clever and you might be very competent, but I haven't yet decided whether I fully trust you. Are you doing this because you want to win, or are you doing this because you're for me, or are you really for yourself? And I'm really struggling, Ray, to think of specific examples, because having created all this stuff, I created it really to make sure that I didn't do that. So I can sometimes be rude, and I can sometimes be dismissive of people who are incompetent. But I've learned how to fake it a lot more. And I've learned now, when I go into a room as a pioneer connector, I have certain triggers, which is well, this is my default tendency, by the way. This is me. I'll be embarrassing. Okay. So you can have this now. You asked for it. So my default tendency as an ENTP or as a pioneer connector is I go into any room and I look for who's the most attractive, who's the most interesting, and who might I really enjoy learning from and just enjoying connecting with. So that's my default tendency. Okay. If there's nobody in the room that's particularly attractive, interesting, or engaging, my second strategy is to provoke an argument, because I love basically debating anything, and I can take either side of any debate and enjoy the intellectual sparring and jousting that goes with it. So now, if there's nobody in the room that's intellectually capable of arguing or keeping me intellectually stimulated, my third tendency is to basically withdraw and to either get my phone out or leave the whole room and just get on with whatever else I'm doing. Now, none of those things are good, by the way, just so you know, but they are all default tendencies that are hardwired into the personality of the pioneer connector. So when I am accidental in the wrong environment, I get it into trouble. So the classic one is, I still remember when I first met Helen's family, my wife, and I went through my usual routine, and basically I started to withdraw and disappeared. And Helen basically came to me after and said, if you ever do that again, then basically, or if you have any desire for any physical intimacy in our relationship, that is a behavior that you will need to change. So that was like, I was like, well, what do you mean? I mean, I was being kind to everyone. And she said, no, you weren't. This is what you did. You always look for the intelligent people and attractive people. Then you argue. And if you can't find anyone to argue with, you basically withdraw and just ignore people. And I had to go and ask 3 people, friends of mine, whether that was true. And in the end, they all agreed it was. So I vowed that I probably ought to change. So now, when I go into a room of people, because I do love meeting new people, as you know, what I do is I still feel sometimes that tendency kick in. But what I do now is I say, I don't want to be that person. I don't want that pattern of behavior, that tendency to be my action. So what I do then is I look around the room and I go, who is the person here who's struggling the most to be here? Who feels the most awkward? Who's the one that is the least attractive in some ways, or the least engaging? And how do I use all of my Yoda superpowers to be as interested in them as I can, to really take the time to get to know them and help them if I can, so that they go away feeling that they are the most important person in that room? That's how I met Jeremy, by the way.
Mic drop.
I've told that joke so many times and it laughs every single time. But that is the honest. I nearly said that's how I met you, but I thought that would be unkind and cruel. So influence is so, once you understand how it works, you can be intentional in the way you choose your actions. And in the end, emotional intelligence happens because there's a level of self-awareness that means you understand what it's like to be on the other side of you. So the more you play and the more we show you, basically, each personality type has a kryptonite. None of us are naturally good at all this stuff, or even if we are, we lose it over time. So that's why influence, I think, is such an important thing, particularly for leaders, even with your family. Influence is something that's hard to win and is so easy to lose in a very short period of time when you get it wrong. So it's worth learning, hopefully, in this series, how we build it, to have a think through those filters of character, chemistry, competence, credibility, recognize all 4 have to be unlocked sequentially, and actually recognize that none of us are good at all 4 at the same time.
100%. I had a boss once who wasn't that much further above me in his career, and he was a nurturer guardian. I'm convinced of it. I didn't know at the time, but he was a nurturer because I wasn't versed in voices language then, but he's a nurturer guardian. And we used to go into meetings with senior directors and he would crumble. He would become like so unconfident in his voice. And I looked at him and thought, what's happened to you? Because as a pioneer connector, it's like our forte of just being there in the moment, responding to questions and all this sort of stuff. And I couldn't get my head around it. And now I understand all about the voices, and it was just a key way that he was undermining his influence because of his lack of confidence. So yeah, it really does make a big difference.
So do you want a quick teaser campaign for next week? So
I do. Go on, hit me.
I'm just sharing my screen, so hopefully you can share it for me. Can you? Or no, there we are. There we go. So if you think of the 5 voices, okay, every single one of us speaks every voice. Don't forget, you are a 5-voice combination, which is why I love the variety. So I said I'm a pioneer, connector, creative, guardian, nurturer. That's my voice order. And if you've been to Giant TV, which you probably have, take the 5 voices assessment. It will give you a voice order, which will help. So pioneers always have to struggle to win influence because of their character. That's a total shock. And every pioneer is ready to grenade me to go, how dare you insinuate that my character is impeachable? The reason is because pioneers love to win. And because you love to win, it means other people are not sure when you're winning whether they're going to win as well. Connectors, you are unbelievable at winning influence. It's really, really annoying. You light everything green, as you'll see over the next couple of weeks. The challenge for connectors is, how do you keep the influence when you've won it, rather than over-promising and under-delivering? We'll come to that one. Guardians, I'm afraid it's chemistry you'll find for you guys, because in the end, you're highly competent, very, very credible, and people of unimpeachable character. But the question is, do I actually like being with you as a guardian? Can you do anything other than work? Can you be interested in things other than the tasks we do? Creatives, well, there's 2 types of creative, aren't there? Creative pioneer, INTP. Yours will be chemistry as well. How do we enjoy being with you? And if you're a creative connector, the issue will be competency. Not, by the way, because we think you're incompetent, but because fundamentally what's happening is when you start speaking, you sound competent, and then you go off telling lots of stories and go off in lots of different places. And I go, hang on, well, I thought you were competent a moment ago. And then nurturers, the same thing. Nurturers are some of the most competent people in the world, what you just described, Ray, but fundamentally, they find it really, really hard to boast about their competency. They find it very, very hard to tell you how good they are at what they do. They'll always want you to like them because of the person that they are. But when you're dealing with someone like a pioneer or a guardian, their first filter is, are you competent? Are you confident in your competence? And actually, do you have a track record that you're going to boast in? So remember, every single voice struggles somewhere. But once you know what it is, and once you know what you can deal with it, we're going to basically take each foundational voice and work our way through to give almost a masterclass in both how do I win trust, but also how do I come through the wall of self-preservation to actually establish long-term influence and impact, because that is where wealth, influence, and opportunity lie in the new world, particularly if part of your work is managing client relationships.
Love it. That was an excellent teaser campaign. So please do, guys, tune in next week when we're going to be talking about the nurturer. I know we're slightly over time, but I have one question which I'm dying to ask you, which is how do you navigate other factors besides those 4 factors such as age, gender, and experience to position yourself with maximum influence?
Yeah, each one of those is almost specific to its own right, isn't it, Ray? So age, knowing your context, age is either a blessing or a challenge. So if you think about it, be aware. So if you are seeking to be a performance coach for a 55-year-old CEO, and you happen to be a 30-year-old, very attractive, intelligent female, just hypothetically, Ray, age is potentially a barrier, because in the end, they look at you and they go, are you really able to help me in my world when you've never been in it? And that's usually where you have to be sensitive to that. You have to be careful how you win influence through competency and credibility. And usually you need somebody else to open the opportunity for you. So gender, I think that in some ways there are barriers to influence for gender for different reasons. I think that, and this is another whole track we're going to go off, I think one of the consequences of the new world and the Me Too and all the things that go with it, I think that women have miss out on a fair amount of apprenticeship opportunities, because men are now very careful about the relationship they have with females in a workplace. So I think gender is a real barrier, not so much to influence, because I think less of an issue, but it's how much investment you get and where you get it from. So you know me, and you always challenge me on this, is to go, how do I make sure that I continue to invest equally in each of those genders, but also recognize it's not easy to be on your own with a woman if you are a man of a certain age. So I'm not sure whether it applies the other way. You'll have to tell me. But there is just this, that there's an increasing sense of wariness about not being inappropriate and not getting yourself into trouble. And as I've said before, human beings are creatures of overreaction. So what we tend to do is, if we're afraid of something, we go from there all the way over to the other side and say, well, I'm not going to get involved. And the goal is to try and find a way in the middle. But I think the world at the moment is trying to work out what that looks like. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's one of those barriers, I think, so much to influence as opportunity and experience. Well, I think it all comes back to that self-awareness, really, Ray, to go, do you know what it's like to be on the side of you? Do you know what it's like to hold up a mirror, to know your tendencies, to understand the way the world sees you? You know, I still see myself as a 24-year-old Olympic athlete with, perfect, blonde hair, blue eyes. Well, actually, that's not true anymore. I'm not that person. There is at least part of me inside that wishes I was, but it's actually being realistic about going, what is appropriate showing up for somebody of my age in a particular context with a particular amount of power and influence. So I always say to people, what is your positional influence? What is your personality influence? What is so personality, power, and position are 3 types of influence. So I have to be careful. I have a very large personality, in case you hadn't realized. I have actually quite a bit of physical power because I'm bigger than most people. And I have a lot of positional power because people see me as Yoda and the guru. So if you think about it, I have to be careful how I exercise it, because I found that a word of challenge from me can often be more crushing, shall we say, than I thought it was meant to be. So self-awareness is the foundation of influence, because it helps you think the emotional intelligence of how am I showing up when I engage with this person. So in the beginning, it's exhausting because a lot of it is conscious competence, but it's like most things, it's a skill set and a know-how and effectively a methodology you can learn, but it does require a fair commitment to self-awareness if you want to be someone of the maximum amount of influence.
So basically, a commitment to self-awareness is how you navigate it.
There you go. I could have said that 5 minutes ago and you'd have finished the show on time. So forgive me for being less succinct, but I do try and answer your question.
It's my ruthless efficiency. It's just a driver. Okay, so next week, as we said, we're going to start or dig deeper into our sales and influence. We would love to hear from you, any situations or questions or scenarios which you'd love us to cover in Personality Yoda. So please do send those to the email on the screen, and we'll be sure to post those to Yoda next week. In the meantime, we hope you have a fantastic week. Any other final words from you, Steve?
I'm going to let you choose the foundational voice we're going to look at next week for influence for them. Go on, who are you going for?
Yeah, we normally start with nurturers, so I feel like we should start elsewhere. I feel like we're going to start with creatives.
Oh, typical. That's the most difficult one. Let's not do creative. Let's do nurturers, because there's too creative. There's too creatives. I knew if I let you in charge, it would all go wrong. So I blame myself entirely. You
did ask the question to give you permission there, so
I did. And then I realised that you chose wrongly. So there we go.
Awesome. We will see you next week, and we hope you have a fantastic week wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you same time, same place. Bye.
Bye-bye.